You're going to want to watch this video on Saturn in the 8th house, if obviously you have Saturn in the 8th house. But also, if you have Saturn in the 8th house in any of the subdivisions, or even in the 8th sign from your rising sign in any subdivision. Also, if you have Saturn giving a strong aspect, or if you just love astrology. Let's break Saturn in the 8th house down to 3 key themes: sovereignty, sensitivity, and flaw awareness. Then we'll take each one of those themes and fan it out on a spectrum from positive to negative, so that we'll get 6 outcomes on these 3 poles. So let's talk first about the sovereignty element. The 8th house has to do with mating, which is partnering, right? But Saturn is a loner planet, so it's very solitary. So if you have Saturn in the 8th house, a big question is, how well are you going to do without a partner, without a mate? Maybe you're very sovereign, or maybe you feel kind of fear of being abandoned. The next issue with Saturn in the 8th house is sensitivity. That's because the 8th house has to do with penetration, but Saturn is impenetrable. So how are you going to penetrate into these situations that require sensitivity? Or how are you penetrated by sensitive things? So the spectrum here is going to be either you're very impervious or you're just very insensitive. The third and final major issue with Saturn in the 8th house is flaw awareness. That's because the 8th house is secret knowing and Saturn is very flaw finding. So with Saturn in the 8th house, the question becomes, how do you deal with flaws and mistakes? Are you an expert judge of them, or are you overly fixated on them, so you're a fault finder? So maybe you were expecting Saturn in the 8th to just represent this or that, A or B. But what I'm telling you here is Saturn in the 8th represents A and B, the positive and the negative permutations of particular themes. And it is the job of us as the reader of a chart with Saturn in the 8th to figure out the balance between the two. The way you do that primarily relies upon the dignity of Saturn in the 8th house, which primarily is a result of the sign that Saturn occupies in that house. If you want to know it in full detail, I have a report available on my website, and I'll put a link to that in the description below the video. You can please go and get one. Let me give you more detailed explanations of each one of these 3 poles, starting with the sovereignty. So what we're talking about here is, how productive are you without a partner? Or how reliant are you upon partners? So on the positive side, if you're okay without a partner, well, that indicates that you have sovereignty. You can do things by yourself, and you can stand up for yourself, and you understand yourself, and you do your own stuff. You don't need other people. Doesn't mean you hate other people, but you don't need them. You have your own ability to do things by yourself. So a person with a positive Saturn in the 8th house would be very self-sufficient and independent. But the negative version of this is the opposite of sovereignty. It's like dependency. So you would feel highly affected by not having a partner or being abandoned, and you would go out of your way to make sure that you keep your partners with you, even if it means compromising yourself. So people with negative Saturn in the 8th house often feel abandoned, alienated, or disregarded. Also, I want to mention, it's important to mention that this sovereignty issue of Saturn in the 8th has an effect on sexuality as well, because it's in the 8th house. And so it's also showing how much you care about social customs regarding sexuality and how much you're independent from them. So the next issue is sensitivity. The question is, how well do you handle sensitive situations. So with a positive Saturn in the 8th house, you will be impervious. Your sensitivity will never get in your way. Other people's little talking behind your backs, or the little snickers that people make when you walk by or fail or do something wrong, just don't bother you. You are unaffected by chit chat and chatter and gossip. But a negative Saturn in the 8th house is a bit different. It's an issue of Saturn being blunt in a place which is very penetrating. So the combination is like a blunt penetration, and that's pretty painful. So typically what you'll find is people just blurting things out, saying things very harshly without a lot of sensitivity to how sharp their words are or how forceful their words are. The third and final very important theme of Saturn in the 8th house is flaw-awareness. And so we're asking, how do you deal with flaws? What's your focus in relation to flaws? If you have a positive Saturn in the 8th house, you have a positive relationship with flaws. You're very aware of them to your advantage. So you're like an expert judge because people can't hide things from you. You can really see when things are correct or incorrect easily. Your critique of any situation is very accurate. For anything where somebody doesn't know what the problem is, a positive Saturn in the 8th house is what we need, because that positive Saturn in the 8th house is going to see what the problem is right away or very clearly. Because it sees the problems so clearly, it's also got a really big head start on knowing how to solve problems. So people with positive Saturn in the 8th house are good fixers. They're good improvers. They're good reformers. Sometimes I describe positive Saturn in the 8th house as like a human lie detector. Negative Saturn in the 8th house, however, is quite the opposite in a way. These people are finding flaws all the time. They just can't stop. Even when the flaws aren't very big, they make a big deal of them. They don't notice anything else except flaws. So we can call them a fault finder. They feel very hypercritical or often hypocritical because they're always looking out at other people for finding flaws. They tend to have this kind of annoying flavor to them because they're so pessimistic and kind of discouraging. They are pretty darn argumentative because nobody likes to hear their flaws all the time, so they get into a lot of arguments. And interestingly, they become pretty paranoid because they are so aware of flaws, they're so aware of mistakes, they're so aware of the chance for something bad to be happening. They get worried all the time. So as I mentioned, you have these positive and negative spectrums for each one of the themes of a planet. And it makes a big difference between whether it's a positive version of Saturn in the 8th or a negative version of Saturn in the 8th. And the way you figure that out is really crucially important. It's mostly by dignity, but there's quite a few details involved in really getting it accurate. I have reports available on my website that will sort out your positivity and negativity for each of your planets and each of your houses. I'll put the link to that in the description below. But I also want to show you some examples of well-known people who have Saturn in the 8th house and how they illustrate these various points. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the chart because it's kind of overwhelming for a simple topic like a planet in a house. But I'll put the basic details about what's important in this chart in the description below. So as for examples for the sovereignty issue, it's pretty difficult to find a famous person who would be negative on the scale of sovereignty because that means they're dependent on other people and they wouldn't really become independently well known. But I can show you a contrast between two types of famous politicians or political activists. And that will illustrate the difference between a positive 8th house Saturn and a negative 8th house Saturn. So for negative 8th house Saturn, it's Benito Mussolini. And for positive, it's Martin Luther King. So with Benito Mussolini, you can see how dependent he is on his partnerships. He's extremely reliant on Hitler, and he allowed practically most of his philosophies to be redefined by Hitler. So with Mussolini, you see a person who really wouldn't have become the famous Benito Mussolini without his partner, Hitler. And also you could see how he pandered to his partner. Whereas if you contrast that with Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther King Jr. Was extremely self-contained and sovereign. And he was standing for what he believed in, although it was extremely unpopular. That's the kind of thing that you can do when you have positive Saturn in the 8th house. Now, to illustrate the sensitivity principle of Saturn in the 8th house, we can keep Mussolini up there because he's, amazingly insensitive. Also, there's two important French serial killers. With positive Saturn in the 8th house, you get imperviousness to public opinion, and also you would get better sensitivity. So interestingly, a lot of artists have positive Saturn in the 8th house. For example, Salvador Dali, a really great example of someone who's very impervious to public opinion and really just is himself and comes up with his own ideas and his own imagery. Also Frida Kahlo, another great example of the same principle. And also Michelangelo. And for the final aspect of Saturn in the 8th house, the Flaw-Awareness, I think we can keep those same three negative examples up there for people who are very, very flaw-oriented. You see these three people, the serial killers and Mussolini, they would intensely study the prey. So they're very, very flaw-aware all the time, but they're also very negative people. On the positive side, you should have people who are able to see things that other people can't see. People who are able to see very deeply, right? So Sigmund Freud has positive Saturn in the 8th house. Good example of psychological skills, the ability to see how the mind is working and the ability to figure out how to fix problems in something so abstract and invisible. And also Edgar Cayce is another good example of positive Saturn in the 8th house, the ability to see what other people can't see. So I'm pretty sure you can see pretty well now how important this positivity versus negativity thing is when you're interpreting Saturn in the 8th house or any planet in any house. To know the positivity of your Saturn, you can largely just rely on the dignity, if you understand how to do dignity. If you don't understand dignity, look it up on my channel because I have quite a few videos about it. I will also put a link in the description below so that you could get a report on your birth chart that will calculate for you your positivity and negativity of your planets and your houses and give you the appropriate interpretations. And also in the description below, if you're kind of more intermediate in astrology, not a beginner, there's some notes on the example charts that explain the key point and why I considered that particular Saturn in that particular example to be either positive or negative. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10, and the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart, because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, just you doing that helps YouTube spot this video and show it to other people. So I would really appreciate that. Thank you very much.